So you were here today talking to Jamestown High School students.
Yeah.
That's terrific. This is something that occurred in 1994.
Yeah.
And do you find that here we are in 2022, does it resonate with?
Oh, my goodness. I was saying to Leanne, one of the teachers who organized the event this morning, some of the stories that I've been telling from Rwanda for literally for 18 years, and the concepts, what's behind this story, what are some of the factors at work and stuff. It's like written for right now, whether we're talking about mass polarization, political polarization and stuff. Sometimes when I'm telling the story on the stage, I'm like, I bet some of these people think I just made that up for now, and it's not. I mean, the stories are always evolving, but it's, yeah, the basic idea, genocide stems from thinking that says my world would be better without you in it, and that kind of thinking, tragically, is timeless.
Mm-hmm. Very, very localized here is,
Yeah.
we'll talk about that in a second. So did you grow up in an Adventist family? Was that
Yeah, very much. I mean, the church and the school, the Adventist school, all through college, 16 years of the Adventist tradition. And one of those years I took out from college to Africa is what really was a change point for me in the journey. I got to volunteer for a year in South Africa in 1978, so in the middle of apartheid. And that was the beginning, I would say, of kind of opening up from the cocoon of growing up in the Adventist community to the much larger world.
So you're one of those pathfinders?
Yeah, you know about the Pathfinders.
I'm aware of that, but we have a small congregation here.
Yeah.
Jamestown, yeah.
Funny, that's the code word that my wife and I used during the genocide. We talked every day on the radio, and whenever the militia would come to the gate, we were not saying the militia's at the gate. I would say, oh, I got to put everything away. The Pathfinders are here. Which I'm kind of embarrassed to say now because I didn't, no negative reflection. That's a great youth program, but that was our code word.
So was that having had that opportunity to go to South Africa now, this is unique. So this would have been 1978, so it would have
Yeah.
been all of, 20 years
I was
old?
20. I turned 21 in Africa.
Yeah.
And that's when I also, I just fell in love with the community, the social structure, the focus on community, and feeling like you can make a difference. I came back from that year saying, okay, I'm going to be a shop teacher, auto mechanics, welding. I'll come back then to Africa, didn't know where, but, whether it's irrigation or whether we're, small engines for generators, here's an opportunity to make a difference. And that really is what gave me direction.
So in the meantime, between 1978 and 1991, when you go back or go to Rwanda, you get married?
Yep. Graduated in 81, got married a week later, 6 weeks later moved to Zimbabwe in 81.
Okay.
So we spent 4 years in Zimbabwe and then 2 years in Zambia, then came back and got an MBA, and then it was actually 90 that we moved to Rwanda. Had that shop teacher MBA combination. It's kind of old school international development.
Part of the religion of the Adventist is mission work?
Very much.
And so were you following, did you feel like you were following sort of that lead, the core belief?
Yeah, ever since I was a little kid, reading stories about missionaries in Africa, the excitement and the adventure. And for me, being part of ADRA, the Adventist Development Relief Agency, building schools, operating clinics, that was living the dream for me, feeling like it wasn't so much about, kind of some of the older stereotypes of missionaries and converting natives, those old stories, but it was about building schools, operating clinics, really partnering with the people to make life better. Super rewarding.
Part of your core belief, I believe, and I can be, obviously, you'll correct me, but is not so, you proselytize, but you don't, you're serving everybody. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, am
And-
I correct in that?
Absolutely. In terms of, ADRA was definitely serving everybody. We're not talking religion or, race or anything like that. What's been interesting is post-genocide, my own thoughts about proselytizing or evangelizing or things like that have changed quite a bit because there is this strong, as you know, within the genocide Holocaust mindset, there's this strong us and them mentality that is just so corrosive and eventually so destructive. And when I see, now I think I'm probably hyper vigilant to us and them thinking. And so often this concept that, we have this truth or we have and we need to convince you and stuff like that, I'm like, nah, that's not really what I understand the character of God to be. And so I've definitely backed away from the idea that I need to convince people or, quote, evangelize and stuff. I think, I'm here on the earth to love and serve. And if some of that stuff seems attractive or makes sense, and we all kind of have our source of inspiration and motivation, we can talk about that. But it's definitely, for me, moving away from more of the us and them mentality, which is really divisive, I think, within religions, denominations, much less religions. And so I'm probably a bit oversensitive maybe, or hypersensitive to the us and them, and recognizing how much really does unite us instead of, so what's so different about the Adventist, or what's so different about these people? It's like, what do we share in common?
So when you roll into Rwanda in 1990, the Hutu and the Tutsi, this is the kind of Hatfield and McCoys, which has been ongoing for some time. How did you integrate into that understanding of that relationship?
I didn't find it Hatfield and McCoy's. I often didn't know who was who. And then when you started, as you're in a country new and stuff, and you start to kind of get your feet and figure out a little bit of the groundwork and stuff, you're like, well, wait a minute, Hutus and Tutsis are married all the time, and they're doing business together, and they're playing soccer together and stuff. So really, what is this division, or what is this construct? And while it's not perfect, like no society is perfect, I always say when you speak the same language, you're going to church together, you're doing business, school and everything, you're going to fall in love. So the story as I saw it, and has become even more clear to me, even through the genocide, was this is not a story of one group against another group. This is really a story of political, and that's where it becomes relevant today. It's a story of politicians, business people constructing a narrative with an enemy. And anytime we can do that, you know it better than most, that we can construct a narrative with an enemy, with an us and them thinking, really based in blame. Like if I can just find one thing that we can pin on them, then we get united and we're like, we're gonna, unfortunately in a genocide situation, we're gonna eliminate them, often because of like one thing. So that one thing thinking is, to me, so much more damaging and dangerous than some of the other divisions we often come up with in terms of regions or religion or ethnicity. So I really go along with those writers and students of Rwanda who say that the planners of the genocide had to work hard to break the bonds between the Hutu and Tutsi. This is not like somebody coming along and pouring gas on an existing fire. No, and not that it was perfect, but there was so much more in common and so much more, I would say, love demonstrated by marriage, that somebody came along and worked hard to break these bonds as opposed to gas on the fire. Does that make sense?
It does, and along with that, consistent with that, factually, on the ground in early 1994 was the plane.
Yeah.
The shooting down of the plane of the president of Rwanda, and all of a sudden the media kicks in.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit that, in case somebody watches this?
That background?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. 6 months after we got there in 1990, a war began in Rwanda. It's kind of interesting. We got there in 90. 28 years earlier was independence, 1962. And I especially like this year, we're 28 years out from the 1994 genocide. And I remember that like yesterday. So I'm thinking when I got there in 90, had to be people there who remembered independence like yesterday, 28 years ago. The violence that had happened at independence, the privilege that the Belgian colonizers showed to the Tutsi people, the discrimination. Many of the people fled at that time, Tutsi people. Some killed, some hid by neighbors. Well, those who fled, they I'm sure thought they could come home a week, a couple months when things settled down. They weren't allowed back 10, 20, finally 30 years later, they got military training. So we moved there in the spring of 90. In the fall of 90, this group of largely refugees or children of refugees attack, mostly from Uganda, and a 3-year war begins. And so that 3-year war is going on. Basically, they want to come home. The local government is like, no, you can't come back. Finally, they get to the negotiating table, ceasefire, the Arusha Accords, summer of 93. We'll have a new government. Everybody will be part of it. But we've got this small group of men and women who say, no, 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 to share power is worse than defeat. And they are the architects of the genocide. So this new government that was supposed to start in December is delayed, January delayed, February, March. April, the plane is shot down. During all that time, even about a year and a half before, they had a radio station. They were constructing their narrative. The Tutsi is the enemy. They've attacked us 3 years ago. They're always the enemy. And that is going to come to this explosive point, April 6, 1994, president's plane is shot down. It's the Tutsis who killed the president. Get out, set up a roadblock, secure your neighborhood. They're the enemy. They've attacked us with guns, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. They're within eroding. You know who any Tutsi or anybody married to a Tutsi, you know where their sympathies lie. We got to get them before they get us. And so the Rwandan Patriotic Front picks up their guns again when ordinary people the genocide starts, they're being slaughtered, and the extremists take over the government. It's like a coup. And now they're fighting the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and they launch this campaign to eliminate all of the Tutsis. You know, what some people don't realize, they see the killing, which is horrific, but they're so intentional, they're so determined to eradicate. I mean, I even think it's like archaeology in the reverse. Instead of discovering stuff, they're going in the courthouse and destroying birth certificates, property deeds, wedding certificates, any evidence these people ever existed. They're on this massive extermination campaign. So a lot of people think, oh, the plane was shot down and kind of spontaneously. No. Nothing spontaneous, really hard, very intentional, hard to pull off. I say it's hard to pull off a genocide. Sometimes I think people just think, oh, this stuff happens. No, it doesn't. It's a relatively small group of architects who are behind this, which, okay, I can keep going, but let me just say this too. I think to myself, if a relatively small group was behind the architects of the genocide, why couldn't there have been another group opposing and countering the ideology, my world would be better without you in it, that ideology? And two groups really well positioned to do that, the United Nations, 2,500 soldiers already in country, and they say 80% of the Rwandans were going to church. So the religious institutions in Rwanda, the UN and the religious institutions are two massive organizations that I think could have stopped the genocide.
So, you know, so much of what you just talked about is called replacement theory. And unfortunately, that's a term that hadn't played at all, any place, anywhere. And again, I don't want to jump ahead of the narrative, but so personally, you are there. You have a role, and you've got a wife, and you have 3 children. And you have to sit down with, is it Barbara? Your wife?
Teresa.
Excuse me, Teresa.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We'll edit that.
Yeah.
Teresa. And just say, this is the fire's getting a little too hot here. I need to save you guys. How was that, how did that little conversation, big conversation go?
You know, the president's plane was shot down Wednesday night, and within an hour, roadblocks were starting to pop up. We're in touch with the embassy Thursday. The embassy, the American embassy Thursday, is saying, okay, while we have evacuation plans in place, assembly points identified, stay home, keep your head down. The Rwandan Patriotic Front is going to take over the city within 4 days. It'd be more dangerous to try to evacuate. Stay home, keep your head down. Friday, totally different message. Everybody's leaving. Ambassador, nobody is staying behind. We're going to leave Saturday and Sunday. You see how fast this is rolling. Saturday, Sunday will be the last convoys out. Decide, are you going with the Saturday or Sunday convoys? Oh, and don't bring any Rwandans. You know, we'll be stopped at roadblocks. We're driving south to Burundi. We'll be stopped at roadblocks. Any Rwandan, doesn't matter their ethnic, whatever their ID card says. That'll be a, you know, it'll be a challenge. It'll compromise the security of the convoy, which I understand. But in our house, we had this young lady who lived and worked in our house and loved on our kids. And anybody who has kids and sees somebody who loves on your kids, that's like fast track to family. And the Rwandans had treated us with so much kindness and courtesy and really privilege. And so my wife and I are thinking, you know, we can't bring them with us. We're quite certain from what we've just learned in the last few days. I would talk on my little local high-frequency radio that we used for our work around the country. Rwanda's a little country, huh? Like Rhode Island or something. I learned in this killing is going on via the radio in the northwest, in the east, over to the west by Lake Kivu. It's all around the place. If we leave, pretty much certain, this young lady, and it happened so fast, plane shot down Wednesday night, the young man who was at our house for the watchman, within an hour, roadblocks up, he didn't even have time to go home. And they both had the Tutsi ID card. They both were marked as the enemy. So my wife and I are in the bedroom, we're talking, we're praying, and we're like, you know, this wasn't a new idea, evacuation coming. We've been through a 3-year war. Evacuation had been part of a conversation before, but now, of course, it was very real. Everybody's leaving, the ambassador and everyone. But we're like, how can we leave these 2 people in our house to be killed? And so we thought, you know, maybe we can use this privilege that the Rwandans give foreigners. If I stay here with these 2 people, maybe we can save them. And fortunately, although it had its own other dynamics, my mom and dad were there. And so I'm actually 2 years older now than my dad was then, 3 years, I think. So that made it really possible. I mean, Teresa could have done it by herself, taken the kids out by herself, but having my mom and dad, I can't think of anybody I would have rather had but my dad there. So my wife and I, thinking maybe it'll be for 2 weeks. This probably won't be longer than 2 weeks. We don't know that all of those 2,500, almost all of the UN soldiers will leave. We don't know more than 1 million people will be killed, that it'll go on for 3 months. But what we know is 2 people in our house may be killed, and if I stay, maybe we could use that privilege. And they did survive. And the story goes on, but it wasn't, you know, Teresa initially would tell you she didn't think we had a choice. But when I said, well, wait, you know, we're private citizens. The embassy can't tell us what to do. And when she realized that, she was completely on board. You know, I think it's hard to see this through anything other than the lens of family. If you start seeing the people in your house as family, that's a whole different lens. So it wasn't like, it was like part of our family could go to safety and part of our family couldn't. So what are we going to do for our whole family? Teresa, okay, I'll take the kids to safety. You stay with this part of the family here in the house. Probably 3 weeks we'll be back together again. That was our naive thinking at that time.
As a foreigner with a passport there, did you deem yourself safe? Because you weren't obviously a Tutsi, but simply a person who had in the employ people who were the T or whatever it was.
Yeah, you know, so many times too, it's not necessarily the reality, that matters, it's the perception. And there was definitely a perception of, America, and, that you maybe have this certain privilege, or you have this government behind you or something. But we had been in Africa long enough and outside America long enough to understand that's not the reality. In fact, I signed the embassy when I told them I wasn't leaving. They said, okay, after trying to convince me different ways to leave, they said, okay, you need to sign on this paper that you've refused the help of the U.S. government to leave Rwanda. And so I pretty much had cut ties with the government in terms of that kind of support. The other thing too, plane is shot down Wednesday night. Thursday night, a gang comes to our gate. We don't know. We're putting the kids to bed in the hallway. We had a brick house, and the interior walls were made out of brick. Didn't think about it much until that time, when you're trying to get as many bricks between your kids and the bullets as possible. And neighbor ladies come out and address and actually get between this gang and our gate. They tell us the next morning, there was a gang here intent on killing you and your family. And I still don't know why. That kind of, because like you said, we're not Tutsi, we're not the target. There was rumors, this is my best guess, rumors that the Belgians were involved with shooting the plane down. Maybe they mistook us as just white foreigners for Belgians. But what's so important to me, obviously, is these neighbor ladies courageously stood up and just started telling stories about our family doing acts of kindness. Started talking about our kids playing with their kids. And somehow, well, the way I explained it to the kids at the high school this morning, I love this. I got this drawing of a brain, and down here in the stem is the fight-flight part. And up here is the good place, the frontal lobe, compassion, empathy, creativity, and stuff. These guys set on killing us, no doubt, down here in the fight-flight, and these ladies start telling stories, which at least for the leader, if not for everybody, got them somewhat out of that fight-flight to the good place. They make a decision and they turn away. And so there was definitely a certain amount of privilege that we experienced as Americans or as foreigners or as simply not being Tutsi. But there was also times in the crazy chaosness that I was targeted. And so often when I think about safety and security and during that time, I think about relationships, A guy actually offered me a handgun, a Rwandan friend offered me a handgun, and I said, no thanks. I didn't know how to use guns anyway, but I just felt like especially as I got out and started traveling around and working with orphanages, traveling with a gun would give a different message than traveling unarmed.
So your wife, father, mother, 3 children get in your van, are escorted out of where you are in Rwanda, heading towards Burundi, and working with, I assume, the ambassadors.
Yeah, actually, the ambassador was in that convoy. It was the next to the last. There was one unofficial convoy after that, but it was the last official convoy out of Rwanda down to Burundi, where Teresa thought she would remain with the children until a couple weeks and she'd come home. My mom and dad actually were scheduled to fly home in a couple of days, so they got to Burundi, then got a flight to Nairobi and got on the regular scheduled flight and came back to the States. But my wife, she'll tell you she didn't want to go any farther than she had to. She didn't want to lose contact, communication. Yep. Burundi got too crazy, too violent, because Burundi is like a twin to Rwanda in many ways. And so the violence in Rwanda was having an impact on Burundi. So she did move the children to Nairobi, Kenya. And that's where she spent the remainder of the 3 months of the genocide in Nairobi, Kenya. But fortunately, that little radio with wires on the ridge of our house, dipole antenna, sent a signal, and we could talk 1,000 miles every day. Sometimes a lot of static, but we were able to talk every day during the genocide on the radio, which was an enormous, the best part of my day.
Well, interestingly enough, and just a part of the serendipity of the Jackson Center, sitting in the seat you are currently in 2008, I believe, we had Ambassador Robert Kruger from Burundi. And he was the ambassador at the time all this was happening.
No kidding.
And so, in a sense, though you may not know the name or even
Yeah.
have ever met him,
Yeah.
he was there.
Interesting.
And he wrote a book on Burundi and genocide and spoke very eloquently about the definition of genocide. He just passed this past year.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So just a kind of a
Yeah,
small
interesting.
world environment. So your wife is safely out of Rwanda. You have opportunities to, because of somewhat of your privilege, to even interface with the prime minister,
Yeah,
who was a Hutu.
yeah.
And in order, situations which you wanted to preserve and save Tutsis. So talk about that little story where you are literally in the government office wanting to meet the prime minister, the man who's making this all happen.
Yeah, sure didn't want to meet him, but I needed to. After 3 weeks of being trapped in our home, the government is taken over by extremists, okay? A coup has happened, and they've killed the prime minister. The president killed in the plane crash. They killed the prime minister, no question about who killed the prime minister, put in their own, I call bogus prime minister. They made an announcement, this coup government.
Jean
Kambanda.
Okay.
Kambanda. And they put in, they made an announcement on the radio from the 24/7 curfew they'd been enforcing for 3 weeks. If you have a legitimate reason to be out of your house, come, we'll give you a travel permit. And that was interesting time. One of the people in my house with me, Pastor Sarayan Bangokira, was the financial officer for the Adventist church in the country of Rwanda. And I remember a conversation with him saying, Pastor, there's got to be something we can do more than just here at the house. And he says, well, if you're going to do anything outside the house, you got to build a relationship with the people in power, the people who are doing genocide. So that relationship will begin with Colonel Renzaho, the colonel in charge of the city. The extremists who took over the government quickly moved out of Kigali because of the violence to a little safer area in the town of Gitarama. It was called Gitarama at that time. And so I'll begin to have a relationship with this colonel in that he'll give me a travel permit. He'll actually tell me some orphanages that I can help. He'll help me with a truck in transport because I need to start right away. I find at the biggest orphanage, kids are dying from diarrhea. They just need water, a little bit of medicine. And so I'll buy stolen powdered milk from thieves and stuff, and I'll store it in this colonel's office. Well, towards the end of the genocide, of course, we didn't know it was the end. We didn't know when it would end. But towards the end of June, Gasikwa Alize, one of the Rwandan men I worked a lot with, and I were bringing water to this orphanage, surrounded by about 50 guys with machine guns, other weapons. They had said the day before, we know you have Tutsi children here. We're coming, empty the place. We're coming back tomorrow. We don't care who's here. We'll kill them all. I don't know about that. I show up with Gasikwa, and about 5 minutes later, these guys materialize all around us, about 50 of them with their assault rifles. And the leader comes in, green Mercedes station wagon, cloud of dust in the parking lot, gets out. I try to greet him, shake his hand. He brushes right past me, goes to the young brother of the director. Where's Damas, the director? Come to find out, they want to kill him first, and then they'll kill everybody else. But here's the problem for him, is this foreigner in the middle of the parking lot. And it's a very interesting dynamics going on. I have some sort of official connection with the colonel in charge of the city. He's given me a travel permit. He has sent me to this orphanage to help them, which a lot of people, when they're thinking about, we often think good guy, bad guy. Okay, doing genocide, obviously bad guy. Why did he send you to an orphanage with Tutsi? Because all of a sudden we start to see the reality of life. There's no such thing as good guy, bad guy, and we're all this complex mixture. Any case, that episode will end with some police officers coming and showing up, leaving the orphanage in their care, and going back to the colonel's office, even though I knew he wasn't there. And that's when his secretary said, well, no, the colonel, her boss, is not here, but the prime minister's here on a surprise visit. I'm like, that's terrible. And she's like, no, 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 ask him for help. And that just, how, you couldn't have said something more bizarre or more absurd than ask one of the three guys on top of the pyramid of this genocide to help you stop a massacre of kids. I asked him, he stopped it. I think that's another story, his motives, what he wanted to do with those kids and everything else. But the point for me is, one, you often don't know what powerful allies you might find in the group that you call the enemy. And I'm sure some people think that's not ethical, and maybe we could have an interesting conversation about that. But the point is, yes, these people must be brought to justice, but that day wasn't the day. They were in power. And while I think he used those children eventually with his plans, his genocidal government was crumbling. French had arrived in the western part to set up, quote, safe havens. I think he wanted French in the middle of the country to prop up his government in the middle, and maybe these orphans would be an excuse for a safe haven. I don't know his reasons. But that idea of the most unlikely ally that day still boggles my mind. But, you know, even more, perhaps more important, is that secretary. You know, so many times, like, we think we got to talk to a senator, or we got to talk to these different people. People who are there behind the scenes, they know what's going on. And sometimes they're our best allies in these, listening to local people. I can't get that message not only across to people, but for myself too. Your best hope of something sustainable is going to come through a partnership, ideally, where the local people are the lead partners. And in that kind of thing, there was no question. This lady was the lead.
So all of this is really the old concept of situation ethics.
It could be.
You know, where you're caught in a position where there is probably not a good answer, but sometimes
You don't debate it until years later. In the
Exactly.
middle of it, you're like, how are we going to survive?
Exactly. And so there are so many situations like that, but this seems like one of them.
Yeah.
Did your faith at that point get tested?
Oh, yeah. Okay, in a nutshell, at the beginning, I'm kind of making a deal with God. I'm like, look, God, you wanted me to stay, you keep me alive. That should be the deal. After about 2 weeks, I'm like, this isn't working. That doesn't feel right. This doesn't make sense. And I realized I was really motivated. I mean, that deal was really based on my fears. And I think a deal brokered on fears, well, you're already in trouble. I decided at that point that, you know what, I don't want my wife to be a widow and kids to grow up with a dad, but I'm going to just trust, and that God will take care of my wife and my kids. I'm not going to try to make a deal. And, you know, the faith journey has really been that. It's been a journey over the years. I mean, at the beginning, I look at how kind of simple and that idea, well, you keep me alive, I stayed. And then what does it look like when you trust? Or what does it look like when some of the things you learned as a kid, you're not, I mean, you know, it's not like you pray for people and they're protected. You pray for people and you still see them with the Bible over their head being massacred. And you're like, well, what about all those promises in the Bible? You start getting challenged with a lot of those things about faith. And for me, my whole idea about God shifted so much during and after the genocide, from an idea of asking God to do something to the idea that I think God works through people and their choices much more than independently doing a miracle, which in many ways to me makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more empowering, because if I'm just sitting around saying, okay, come on, God, fix that. Come on, God, fix that. What's my role? Besides just trying to direct the magic, miracle-working God, that's ridiculous. But when I recognize I can have a part of this. See, people say, where's God in the genocide? And I totally get that. I think that's a valid question. For me, though, the question is a little more nuanced. Where are the people who claim to be in love and motivated by the love of God during the genocide? That, to me, is a much more relevant and a much more actionable question than simply, where's God?
You identified early on two groups which were deficient in their response to this. The
Yeah.
United Nations
Yeah, and religious
and
organizations.
religious organizations. Was there I know the United Nations and is one of the dark spots in the United Nations, the whole Rwanda
History, yeah.
history, and the United States was part of that. I
Big
mean,
part.
You can't, and Clinton, all of those people have variously over time apologized and just, was very remorseful. It doesn't help the situation that occurred on the ground, and hopefully lessons were learned. Did you have opportunity, once you were able to leave, you saw the genocide ends? I mean, there's carnage, there's 800,000 people, there are mass graves, finally, United Nations creates an international tribunal for Rwanda, where you had a chance to meet U.S. officials or UN officials, or just saying, hey, I was there, just in case you're curious, this is what happened.
Not many opportunities to do that. I was, Renzaho, the colonel in charge of the city, his attorney contacted me. We actually met for several hours in the airport in Nairobi years ago. I think that he soon recognized that, he maybe thought that I could testify on behalf of the colonel, the good that the colonel did during the genocide. But I think he recognized that the prosecution would say, hey, we're not debating any good this guy did. He's being prosecuted for the genocidal crimes that he did. And they would actually use his position and the power that made it possible for him to do good to demonstrate, yeah, but he also did this. He was in control, Right. So I was never called in on that. I was pretty frustrated for years, and it's still a certain level of frustration that they didn't have the trials in Rwanda. And I understand some of their arguments of, feeling like they wouldn't get a fair trial or anything like that. But there's also, I think, a kind of a racism that's involved with that story too. We don't necessarily need to go there, but one of the things two pictures I want to paint for you real quick. One of the upper level leaders, not top, but upper level leaders, was caught and tried in Rwanda. And to see this man who for months, more than a year before the genocide, would travel around Mercedes, fancy clothes, suits and stuff, speak to thousands of people in an auditorium with hate speech and the message of us and them and blaming the Tutsi. To see him in a simple prison uniform in a wooden chair, even though he didn't confess, but for people to see that accountability was huge, and they were denied that with it being in Arusha. What I found interesting, though, was, with my years of frustration that, and all the money that was invested there, and then the lack of funds available for prosecution within Rwanda, all the different stories. But what I found really interesting, talking to some folks in the Rwandan judicial, probably just 3 or 4 years ago, explaining my frustration there, and instead of just saying, yeah, that was all wrong and stuff, they said they had more understanding. They had a very nuanced approach to it, and the challenges, instead of saying, yeah, we could have done it here and they stole it there, he started to identify some of the challenges that would have been faced in doing it in Rwanda. And that idea, today in our polarized society, it's like anything you say that kind of mirrors or would reinforce the position of the other, we're going to back away from it. We'll never, even though any common ground or things that we understand, we're afraid to do that because we think it'll weaken our position. I feel like Rwanda feels itself in a strong enough position that they can acknowledge some of the argument on the other side and still not feel like they have been minimized, or I think they're in an amazing position right now when you look at their economic growth, when you look at the number of people. I'm sure you're aware, Rwanda's one of the first, if not the primary example or place where the rank and file people have been brought to some form of justice. Holocaust, all these other places, top leaders, mid-level, but not the rank and file. More than 250,000 people. They had more than 1.9 million cases of the ordinary people in these community courts called gacaca in Rwanda. 12,000 community courts. If you put pins on the map in Rwanda for all these courts, the map would be just a map of pin. 12,000 community courts where community members are the facilitators / judges, where they're empowered to hear the confession of those who want to, and then say, I think this person is not safe to go into the community service program that was there. They need to go back to jail. The whole program in Rwanda of, I kind of moved away from my frustration on the things that didn't happen for Rwanda, and just moved into amazement at how Rwanda, in a restorative process, made healing a priority over justice, not in place of justice, because I think justice is necessary part of healing. As I understand it, the restorative model says we got to understand the harm, and then we need to make a repair plan. And part of that repair plan is justice, but our end goal is not justice. Our end goal is healing. And that, I think, is a formula for breaking the cycle of violence, because we all know just bringing somebody to justice doesn't necessarily break this. We talk about it being a preventative, some sort of, what's that word, to hopefully it won't happen again. But this idea of healing on the top of the pyramid, justice is part of it. I think there's a lot to learn on a national level, as well as for me. I grew up in a whose fault, who's to blame, they'll get punished, okay, don't do it again. And we don't repair anything. Rwanda, I think, is giving us an incredibly powerful model, not without problems, but incredibly powerful model of all the voices speaking, and at least as many as we can possibly bring, understanding the harm, making a repair plan. When people hear that somebody who did genocide is building a road or doing radical terracing, they're like, sounds like a slap on the wrist to me, which in a punitive model, it would be. It would be. But in a restorative model, our priority is not, our top end goal is not justice, retributive justice. It is restorative healing. And that calls for some sacrifices, which are really hard to make, and why I think some restorative practices will never be fully embraced by people. One reason, not everybody's interested in collaborating, but another reason is it's so hard. I don't know how many generations it will take to change our thinking from a transactional, punitive way to more of a transformative, healing pathway. And I think, unfortunately, those pathways often are not parallel or even together.
Given your model of what has happened in Rwanda, a restorative justice model, how do you reconcile that with Paul Kagame's kind of action against the Hotel Rwanda notable
Paul Rusesabagina.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I was in that hotel 4 or 5 times a week during the genocide. I never saw him once, or at least that I recognized him. I'm sure he was there. I have no doubt that he was there. But from my perspective, and I think most of the people you talk to who are in that hotel, the security of that hotel was really about a small handful of UN soldiers who were there. And those, while there were 2,500 before, not all of them, somewhere under 300, shy of 300, stayed by General Dallaire, Henry Adiaho from Ghana, his assistant, with some very courageous soldiers who stayed and saved thousands of lives, make a powerful argument that if all 2,500 would have stayed, they could have stopped the genocide. So one of those small pockets of those just shy of 300 UN soldiers was that hotel. So first off, the story is not correct from the beginning, as it's a one-man hero who is providing safety at this hotel. I think it would have been an incredible educational tool if the movie would have been made as it happened, with this handful of largely West African UN soldiers and the ability they had to provide a safe haven there. What a tool for teachers and everyone else. From that, though, initially I was ready to give the movie a pass because, you know, it's Hollywood and we want to just let people know, and it'll be the opening door, and they'll, if they're interested, they'll learn more and they'll learn the real story. But then when I saw how he began to use that platform, I was on an email list for years of his, and it was like every email after another, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, everything. And there was nothing good, according to him, happening in Rwanda. And I was traveling back there and I'm like, there's amazing things happening here. And so the fact that he then went on, not just from emails and stuff, but to actually they've gathered evidence, and he openly says, you can hear the recording on YouTube, we've tried all means possible to change the government in Rwanda. We failed. Now we have to, he didn't say all means, we've tried all peaceful, I think are his words, or democratic, I think peaceful means possible to change. Now we have to use all means necessary to change the government. So he's an outspoken enemy of the government of Rwanda. And honestly, so many people in a very simplistic way, they think Paul Kagame is the government of Rwanda, and he's not. Rwanda has incredible examples of accountability and transparency in governance, incredible examples of decentralizing government and putting the power into the hands of the people. So it's a very, from my perspective, narrow, simplistic view to simply say Paul Kagame is the government of Rwanda, or his, they like to use the word regime is one of their favorite words. When I see the leadership that did away, for example, with the death penalty. Some experts said, you'll never restore peace in Rwanda without the death penalty. Well, with President Kagame's leadership, they did away with the death penalty. The equality and gender equality and the role of women in rebuilding peace. That Rwanda is such a more nuanced picture. So when he was captured, in the way he was captured and stuff, I'm not ready to throw all of my time and energy into the legality of his capture. I think he had a fair trial, which of course is debatable by many people's terms, but it would have been much more, I think, valuable and stuff if he would have continued to attend. But as you probably know, he quit attending his own trial halfway through. And Rwanda has always been open to anybody who wants to come and see, observe what's going on, visit him in prison. All of those things were there. And so I think that there was a very emotional response to a perceived Hollywood legend that was, to me, understandable, but was not the right picture. He was tried with a dozen other men who are working to overthrow the government of Rwanda. And when I look at that, and I'm like, 28 years later, you see the level of peace, you see the level of increased health care, of education opportunities and economic opportunities in a country that has now become refugee. They've got at least more than 6 refugee camps from all the violence of the surrounding countries. People are come to Rwanda to be safe now. And you see all of the safety, security, progress, gender equality, interest in the environment and stuff. And we're not just, like some people would try to say, trying to throw somebody out of power. We're trying to derail an incredibly powerful journey in so many areas, restorative justice being one of them, that I think unfortunately gets narrowed down to just, oh, one man and he's a dictator. And it's just, while there are challenges and it's a different kind of democracy than the world has ever really, I think, seen, and some people wouldn't even use that word, you can have those conversations, but I see people sleeping safely at night. I see people finding education for their kids. I see people, okay, their not very good friend is right now in India, a Rwandan friend, getting a transplant. They're not ready at Rwanda's level to do kidney transplants, but they've got an agreement with the government of India. things are available to people that have never been available before in a rate. I mean, they're making cell phones there, shoot electric cars and motorcycle. There's just all kinds of progress. But even more than on the technical side is what I would call the social progress that's being made bit by bit. There's still people who are angry and understandable. Gacaca for them was a joke. They can give you all the problems with it. And I understand. I don't necessarily agree, but I understand. But then there was so much healing that has happened through that process. I'm like, show me a better way.
So, just out of curiosity, the ICTR occurs, and one of the persons tried and pled guilty was Gene Kambanda, your buddy. Does it ever dawn on you kind of, in order to save people, you had to kind of beg assistance from somebody of that nature who got his deemed just reward? Does that strike you at all? I mean, do you ever think about that? I mean, here pled guilty, there he is, life imprisonment, and yet, in order to accomplish what was deemed appropriate, you had to do what you did.
Obviously, I've thought about it, but never with any serious question.
Yep.
No, you are in the heat of the moment. You are surrounded by these guys with machine guns. I mean, for years, Peter, when I would tell that story, I would get knots in my stomach. And I was so glad that I finally went and saw a counselor maybe 6 years after the genocide. I still had knots for years later because I never talked to him about the potential of re-traumatizing yourself, and the difference, what I'm learning now, the difference between remembering and reliving. Two very different experiences. Right. And so, but in all of that journey, no, you're in the middle of that, and you just kind of went from one step to another. On that particular day, I didn't know what we were going to do until the lieutenant and about 6 police officers showed up. Then I went to the police camp because he wanted me to go and try to get reinforcements. I tried, didn't know what to do. I finally found a guy at the police camp I had known before the genocide, kind of another interesting side story. He's like, Wilkens, you're still here? And I'm like, yeah, and I'm at the orphanage and we're surrounded. He tried, couldn't get help. I go to the office of the colonel. And you're just kind of going step by step. And then the secretary says, ask the prime minister. You go step by step, but you're driven by desperation. And so in the end, when he stops that massacre, you're just overwhelmed with gratitude that they're not killed. And it doesn't at all, put you. I hesitated often in telling the story of even using the word ally with Kambanda because it just seems so wrong. That just seems messed up. But in the moment, and this is one thing that really helped me a lot, Samantha Power's book, Chasing the Flame, Sergio, I always slaughter his last name, but Sergio from the UN, he's there busy working with the UN, repatriating people back into Cambodia from Vietnam. Part of Cambodia is still controlled by the Khmer Rouge. And the UN is like, no, Sergio, you can't talk to them. They're genocide people. They committed genocide. He's like, we're returning families, farmers to that area. We've got it. Through the back door, he goes around. And this line out of the book just gave me so much sense of peace, and that kind of, this is messed up idea brought some order to it. He said, today they would not be brought to justice, but today they're in power. And they will be. We will work tirelessly to bring them to justice. But today they're in power. We've got to deal with that reality today and talk. We could go on and have a really interesting conversation about Afghanistan and America's unwillingness to talk with the Taliban years ago, right after 9/11, and where we ended up at the end of all the years there in terms of not going to talk or negotiate with terrorists. So this whole idea of being able to maintain communication, and then sometimes it'll yield some unimaginably powerful, not always, but the potential, I think, is something, the potential for somebody, for everybody, not somebody, potential for everybody to do something kind and compassionate is something I never want to underestimate. And actually, I don't think he did it out of kindness and compassion, to be honest, but the potential
Well,
still stands.
You tapped into an agenda which, though not articulated,
Yeah,
was
yeah,
there. It
yeah,
clearly
I
was
think
there.
so.
He had an end game, if you will,
Yeah.
or this would be another step. You have, from your experiences, and then going back and forth to Rwanda, an experience like no other. I mean, your life journey of "I'm not leaving" is one which resonates today, 2022, and you see it playing out in Ukraine. You see it playing out in a lot of situations where this simply, against all odds, uh, the justification continues. Do you ever pause and kind of reflect and say that I've been placed on this earth for a reason? I mean, do you ever get to that kind of, high 10,000-foot approach saying, given what happened, given that you're not dead and you're not a martyr and your story is not being continued by your family, but by you, through this process, that, there's a God-given reason for you to have this bully pulpit?
Never really thought of it as a bully pulpit. But this morning at the high school here in town, a kid said to me, nobody ever asked me this before. That's what I love when I'm talking with high school students. They're bringing out new stuff. Did they pay you big for what you did? And I just started laughing. I'm like, no, I mean, we're on this missionary salary. But I've been paid so big time by the Rwandan people, their hearts of gratitude and being part of something. When we talk about the genocide, it's so easy to focus. The 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, so easy to focus on the horror and the loss. And we're never going to ignore that, I hope, never. Never ignore, never forget. However, to bring about sustainable change is not the horror and the violence, I don't think, that does that. I think it's the people who stand up against it, those examples of that courage. And as we share those stories with students, like this morning at the high school, and they're up around afterwards and with their questions, and what about you? What about your anger? Was there a turning point for you in between anger and bitterness and some sort of healing? Mm-hmm. A kid is just, they're asking you that in this auditorium full of kids, and you have this opportunity to say, well, yeah, it's an ongoing journey right now, and talk about 21 years later, meeting the leader of the killing squad who was surrounding us at the orphanage, and the anger 21 years later, anger to the point of feeling like vomiting kind of anger, and how that ongoing journey, you recognize hanging on to anger and bitterness is this poison that still gives the perpetrators access, almost unregulated access to my heart and my thinking, my mind. Definitely can impact my health. And then you start saying, you know what? Getting free from anger and bitterness is not about who you're angry and whether they deserve it. It's about me. And in my case, it's about my grandsons. I've got these perfect little boys who are my grandsons now. I do not want my anger and bitterness to influence them and their lives. And so when you have opportunities to talk about things that important, to talk about moving from a punitive approach to a restorative approach, which we're beginning to see in our schools. I mean, some schools it's more than 10 years. Others are just waking up. I was outside of Buffalo yesterday, and their district next year is moving towards a more restorative approach to discipline in that district, Williamsville up there. And you see those things and you recognize we get to have part of it. We get to tell part of Rwanda's story. We get to introduce people to that story in Rwanda. Those are incredible opportunities that I just feel really grateful for. And I mean, the story would be going on and it would be told and it would be shared in many other ways if I wasn't around. But I'm just super grateful that I have that part. I mean, kids say, why aren't you cynical? I was in Colombia, 7 years ago, and they're talking about FARC coming out and be reintegrated in the country there. 75 years of the violence and kidnapping and murder. And those kids there, high school seniors, are saying to me, we find it hard to understand what's happened and is happening in Rwanda, but why aren't you cynical? And being able to talk to students about this strategy of finding the good. I'm not ignoring the injustices and the harms in the world, but our brain naturally goes that direction. Negative sticks like Velcro, they say. Positive slides off like that. So being intentional about finding the good. When we take teachers to Rwanda, I tell them, first visit to the Kigali Genocide Memorial, it's going to be potentially soul destroying. This is horrific stuff. So every morning, every evening, one of you is going to facilitate a Finding the Good session. You're going to talk about something beautiful you saw today, something inspiring that we saw today. Because if we're not intentional about that, this fight against injustice and harm can easily burn us out and destroy us. So I've got to, okay, I'm on a little rant here, but I've got to prioritize the beauty and the good over the injustice and the harm in terms of spending time, taking a break from the news. Right now, I am not comfortable with my reaction to the Ukraine because each time I try to go to those stories, I find myself just falling to pieces, and I'm like, I thought I had a lot of this processed. You know, I thought I could go there, or right now the Tigray region in the northern Ethiopia, and I go in and I listen to the stories and I speak to American Ethiopians, and man, I just find myself again at times just really losing my footing, and I have learned tools to recenter and to try to keep, this good and keep that ahead of you. But it's if I'm not intentional, I keep a gratitude journal. If I'm not intentional about writing down new things, at least 3 new things every day to exercise those pathways in my brain, it's hard to navigate through this platform you say that I've been given now. But when I am, and most of the time I'm able to stay in that positive, finding the good mode. And, there's times like anybody else, you get tired and you're like, I think I'm not gonna, but spending time, especially with the students, I just love the opportunities, and I think they're connecting the dots. And while in many ways I see our country polarizing more and more, I also see a lot of really brilliant young men and women who are examining these stories from the past and what's happening right now. Even 3rd graders. I'm Zooming, 90-minute Zoom with 3rd and 4th graders. It's a long time. Those kids had such great questions. Come in from recess, they write in their journal, looks like what's happening in America now is like the seed, and what happened in Rwanda was the whole watermelon. And I'm like, where is this kid gonna get to as they look at this and they begin to put together the pieces and really challenge this us and them mentality that's such an easy framework for us to adopt and live with?
I don't want to let you go without, you've been in Buffalo, you've been in Williamsville, you're here in Jamestown, you're in Western New York, and certainly a week and a half ago, a horrific thing occurred at Tops Market. And with that was an 18-year-old who talked about something called replacement theory. Replacement theory not too dissimilar to what maybe some of the Hutu were media blasting out against the Tutsi. And the reaction community-wise is certainly anger, bitter, all that stuff. Do you see in that type of thing where even things like a forgiveness aspect to your theory would be ever applicable, or are you able to see beyond what the right here, right now, 10 people dead, others injured, and somebody who's got advocating a theory which is not him alone, replacement theory? Is there an analogy here? Or am I leaping too far?
There's all kinds of parallels. I mean, that basic idea that I put forth to the kids this morning, and that I put forth to kids for 18 years, genocide stems from thinking that says my world would be better without you in it. It's very easy to see that and apply it to others. What's not so easy is to see it and address it in myself. And I think that's one of the key things that I hope when these tragedies happen, it's so easy, especially for those of us farther removed who did not lose family members and we're not, friends, and we're not directly impacted like it impacted the community there in that neighborhood in Buffalo particular. How quickly or how willing am I to do some serious self-examination and my own us and them thinking? The other thought that comes to my mind, and addressing that, and I know I've got that in my mind. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do to rewire my brain, and I'm big on neuroplasticity and the ability to rewire the brain. That gives me so much hope. That gives me a framework to believe that people can change. And so in my own rewiring process, I am working on this concept I'm calling empathy first. It's so easy to be defensive first, or to be judgmental first, or to be even exclusive first. And this idea of, am I spending time here in the fight-flight part of my brain, or how much time can I spend and live in the good place, in the frontal lobe, where there is potential for empathy and creativity and pranks on your friends and stuff like that. And what do I do that helps me recognize when I'm down here and helps get me up here? What are those practices so that I really can have a first response of empathy? You see, when we hear these stories on the news or we watch these broadcasts, it's so easy to move into judgment and, well, this shouldn't or that, and quote, problem solving. And I'm trying to tell myself, stop, just listen, What do I hear? How can I practice empathy if I'm constantly looking at things from my chair, my perspective? It's really hard to get out of my chair and put somebody else who's different from me, or at least I think in ways is different from me, and try to see it through their eyes. And that's what I was trying to do, especially when, I knew I'm coming here to Buffalo and then that tragedy happens, is how can I just shut down the judgment, the fix-it stuff long enough to listen? Because if people who have experienced loss like that do not experience empathy, boatloads of empathy, then any kind of repair plan, any kind of reconciliation or healing is potentially even counterproductive until we've just had this. And I don't know, honestly, how long is the empathy period in this journey to try to, because eventually I'm not letting go of problem solving, absolutely not. But I think I don't spend enough time, and I have a hunch that I'm not alone in the empathy part of the journey. Empathy first, and then listening. And in Rwanda's case, it was the people themselves who were able to speak. In these community courts, people learn the truth, and it was the community who facilitated it. It was the place in the same community where the confessions made, and it's that same place in the community where people started talking. We're not going to have a cut and paste from Rwanda to Buffalo or any place else, but there's concepts and principles in this idea that everybody's voice has to be heard. But I don't want to tell a victim that the perpetrator's voice needs to be heard until the victim has just been soaked and saturated with empathy. Because that's why I say empathy first. Because when we start talking about healing and reconciliation without adequate empathy or without safety, so what are we going to do to really establish safety? Don't talk to me about restorative practices until it's safe. And that was a big deal in Rwanda. Restoring safety in the country. Sleeping at night knowing your kids, your spouse is not going to be taken in the middle of the night. So those kind of foundational stones of community, safety, empathy, really big part of the conversation before we move to that next step, understanding the harm. Long time, really, what is it to understand the harm? I mean, my heart is broken as I hear about this guy who goes and helps people with I know what it's like to just in an airport have a carry-on that doesn't have wheels. Well, big first world problem for me, huh? But what about for the families carrying groceries and this guy giving his time to do that for people, you know? The lady who, her little girl was always knocking on this grandma's door every time they went past it. And now grandma's been killed.
Yeah.
How do we really spend time to understand the harm part before we would go to the repair plan? So I do believe there's a lot of inspiration in Rwanda's story, and there's a lot of concrete framework and strategies in Rwanda's story. But they're not going to be cut and pasted. But the way I see it, it starts with empathy, then trying to understand the harm, then looking at a repair plan.
I am so thrilled you paused to have us talk today and to learn about.
Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really happy to be here at the Jackson. I'm looking forward to the tour afterwards.
Mary be here, about the whole I'm not leaving. So that concept is one which you applied to Rwanda, and that you did not leave a situation. And I'm also thrilled that you're not leaving. I'm not leaving this message and this that you have, that you continue this. And so,
well, thank
on
you.
behalf of the Jackson Center and all that we
Thank
do
you.
here, you are just such a living example of Mr. Restorative Justice. I
Well,
appreciate
thank you.
that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And it's one of the things I love about this work. People think, oh, you're just always genocide, Holocaust, and how depressing. And I'm like, no, you don't know the amazing people I get to meet and work with and the amazing students. I feel like the fortunate one for sure.